In these sessions, we are going to continue with event emitter class and a synchronous function and a wait function or instructions. Here we are going to continue with event emitter class. Here Node.js uses events. Node.js uses events module to create and handle custom events. It creates event module or it uses events module to create and handle custom events. The event emitter class can be used to create and handle custom events module. So there is one module for handling and creating that events, that is events module. So similarly, we are going to import, in previous sessions we have seen that how to import module in Node.js. For that, here we are having, we are going to import that events module in event emitter. So there is one syntax for importing the events module in this event emitter here. See the syntax: constant event emitter is equals to use require function to import that module. Use require function and pass inside the brackets in single quote that module name. That is, here we are going to import that events module here. So the syntax for importing that event module is, take one constant like event emitter equals to use require function inside the bracket, pass that module name in single quote. So here all the event emitters emit the event new listener. It emits that event new listener when new listeners are added, and remove the listeners, that is remove listeners when existing listeners are removed. At that time they're adding, whenever new listeners are registered, it emits the new event. Then new listeners, it emits event new listener when new listeners are added, and remove listeners when existing listeners are removed. It also provides another option like boolean capture rejections. The default value for that is false and it automatically captures the rejections. Okay, this is all about event emitter class, that whenever any listeners are added, that event is that all event emitters are emitted with that event new listeners, and whenever we are going to remove that listeners, at the time use remove listeners. Then here you can see listening events. So before emits any event, it must register functions or callbacks to listen to the events. Whenever we are going to register any functions to listen that events, we have to first emits that events, or we have to register that event. Here it is the syntax for adding that listener, like event emitter dot add listener. See the syntax: event emitter dot add listener, and the parameters are event and listener. Similarly, event emitter dot on, and the parameter is event comma listener. So here event emitter dot on and their parameter, and event emitter dot add listeners with the parameters are similar. So both are adding the listeners at the end of listeners array for the specified event. So if multiple calls are for that same event and listeners, it will add that listener multiple times and correspondingly fire multiple times. So if we are going to call, whenever we are going to add any listener and we are going to call that listeners multiple time, it will add that listeners multiple times and it will fire that events multiple times. So both the functions here, event emitter dot add listener and event emitter dot on, both are similar, and this both function returns that emitter, so that calls can be chain here. Okay, so these two functions are similar here for registering the events, that is listening the events. Here next, emitting the events. So every event is name event in Node.js. So we can trigger an event by emit function. Here, see the emit function. Emit with the parameters like event, comma the arguments. So that we can trigger that any event by using the function emit with the parameters event and their arguments. We can pass an arbitrary set of arguments. Here you can see we can pass arbitrary or number of set of arguments to the listener function. So see the syntax for this emitting events. Event emitter dot emit inside the bracket event dot argument 1 argument 2 and so on. We can pass the multiple arguments with the that with that event. So here we will see one example for importing events, registering events and triggering that event. So first importing events. So we have seen that how to import that events. For that use one constant event emitter equals to use require function. Using require function we are going to import that module. We have to import events module here. Okay, then initializing event emitter instances. So how to initialize, like where event emitter is equals to use new keyword here, new event emitter. So in this way we are going to initialize the event emitter instances. Then we have to register to event. Here registering to my event, this is the event name here. So how to register? So event emitter dot on, or otherwise use add listener. Okay, use add listener or use event emitter dot on. Okay, so we are going to use like event emitter dot on inside the bracket event. So event is my event, comma, then here you can see the parameter this listener event comma listener. So my event, this is the event, and comma this is the listener, like message. Which message we are going to print here? Console.log message. So here message is the listener here for this event. So how to trigger this event? So for triggering this event, write event emitter dot emit inside the bracket, give the event name, that is my event, and then arguments like first event we are going to pass argument as a message. That message we are going to print here. So pass this argument as a message like first event. So if we are going to execute this code, we will get the output like first event, that is this. So why? Because we are going to uh, listen this event is we have to print the message. Okay, so that message in that event is first event. Here we have trigger that event, my event comma then the message. Okay, then how to remove that listeners after adding the listener? So the event emitter dot remove listener takes two arguments like event and listener. Similarly, adding the listener, it will take two arguments, event and listener. Okay, then it removes the listeners from the listeners array, and that is subscribed to that event. It removes that listeners from that listener array. While event emitter dot remove all listeners, it removes all the listeners from the array which are subscribed to that particular event. So you see the syntax for this: event emitter dot remove listener with the parameter event and listener. So this remove listener will remove the listener from the listener array. And next one is event emitter dot remove all listeners. It takes the parameter as event. Here you can see the event as an array. That means all the listeners we are going to remove that are mentioned with that event. Then here we will see one example which is having some